Hey guys, tonight we're diving into the candlelit corridors of ancient Rome, specifically the eerie halls of the Vatican in the 9th century, where politics smelled faintly of beeswax, sandalwood, and if we're being honest, a little like mildew and regret. You're walking slowly, your steps echoing across stone floors as torches flicker against frescoed walls. Outside, the Tiber River slinks past sleeping villas. But inside, something is stirring. Not quite alive, not quite gone. This isn't your average bedtime tale. This is the story of a pope who, brace yourself, was exhumed from his grave, dressed in papal robes, seated on a throne, and put on trial by a successor with a grudge. Yes, you heard that right. Tonight, we explore the ghostly absurdity of the Cadaver Synod, a moment so deeply unhinged that even medieval Romans had to say, okay, that's enough. Not from horror, but from the overwhelming wave of secondhand embarrassment. Truly, this is peak what were they thinking energy. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Also, drop a comment with your location and what time it is where you are. It's always fun to see who else is trying to snooze through the fall of Western Civ. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You start in the twilight of an empire. Rome has long since fallen in the West, but its name still haunts the corridors of power. The Pope is not just a religious figure, he's a kingmaker, a diplomat, and sometimes an unwilling pawn in chess games played by very angry noblemen with questionable hygiene. It's the 860s, and things are wobbly. The man of the hour with the many hours to come is Formosus, a bishop from the city of Porto. You don't need to memorize that, but maybe remember it like a sleepy port town with ambitions. Formosus is well-traveled, respected, and, unfortunately, politically useful. You can't throw a relic in this era without hitting a minor civil war or a major succession crisis, and Formosus is constantly dragged into all of them. He's the kind of guy who's trusted with delicate missions to Bulgaria. Why Bulgaria? Because someone needs to sweet-talk foreign kings into respecting Rome, and apparently, Formosus had a solid travel cloak and an even better diplomatic poker face. The Bulgarian king likes him so much, he literally asks the Pope if Formosus can be their official archbishop. That's not how it works, but hey, points for enthusiasm. But here's the thing. Getting popular in the 9th century church is like being the hottest new employee at a cursed company. Everyone either wants you promoted or quietly vanished. Pope John VIII, who you'll hear more about soon, starts getting nervous. Maybe it's Formosus' rising popularity. Maybe it's the fact that he doesn't toe the line quite right. Or maybe the Pope just wakes up one day and chooses melodrama. Either way, tensions grow, and our poor protagonist is soon accused of aspiring to the papacy, which, in this century, is kind of like being accused of wanting the One Ring. Dangerous stuff. Historians still argue whether these accusations were based on actual scheming, misunderstood ambition, or just really bad gossip. Either way, Formosus does what many of us would do when confronted with medieval HR he runs. He is officially excommunicated in 872, and let me tell you, that's no small slap on the wrist. It's spiritual exile. Imagine being cut off not just from your job, but from salvation itself. And all for being a little too good at diplomacy. Maybe. Still, the 9th century is nothing if not wildly inconsistent. A few years later, Pope John VIII is murdered, probably poisoned, maybe stabbed, possibly both. Historians still debate the method. What's certain is that Formosus makes a cautious return to public life. And somehow, through the chaos of multiple rapid-fire papal elections, truly, they were cycling through popes like phone chargers, he climbs back up the ladder. It's now 891, and after all that scandal, exile, and tension, Formosus becomes pope. You'd think this would be the happy ending. Roll credits, play some loop music, everyone goes home. No, he's pope now, but the world around him is cracking. The Holy Roman Empire is crumbling into regional power grabs. Italian nobles are locked in backstabbing contests so intense they might as well hand out gold medals. And Formosus? He's right in the middle. One mainstream historical fact. Formosus' papacy oversaw the coronation of Arnulf of Carinthia, an East Frankish king who was seen as the more legitimate ruler, compared to the reigning Roman emperor, Lambert. This choice will come back to haunt him badly, but for now, he does what popes do. Navigates wars, arbitrates disputes, and tries not to get killed. He's not flashy. He's not radical. He's just trying to survive. And maybe, just maybe, he thinks the worst is behind him. It is not, because just beneath the surface of his seemingly mild reign is a viper's nest of resentment. The nobility of Spoleto, powerful Italian lords who supported the other guy. Lambert aren't thrilled with Formosus' choices. And they don't forgive. Not even after death. Especially not after death. Meanwhile, Formosus' health is declining. You picture him in a candlelit chamber, his robes heavy, his breath ragged. Maybe he dreams of retiring peacefully. Maybe he just wants a nap. But death comes for everyone, even popes. He dies in 896. And if this were any normal story, he'd stay that way. But tonight, you're going to learn that even the grave wasn't enough to stop medieval drama from reaching its final act. You might expect that when a pope dies, the worst thing he has to endure is a slow fade into the footnotes of history. But Formosus is not that lucky. Not even close. His story is about to take a turn so bizarre that even the Vatican's own scribes would later describe it with a kind of that happened shrug. Formosus, at the moment of his death in 896, is already tangled in a dangerous web of politics. You remember Lambert, the not-so-thrilled co-emperor from Spoleto. He and his mother Geltrude are still out there, still furious, and still absolutely not sending fruit baskets to Formosus' estate. This pope had thrown his support behind Arnulf of Carinthia, a rival claimant to the imperial throne, and that snub has consequences. Deep, grimy, festering consequences. So when Formosus dies, his enemies don't see closure. They see opportunity. But before we get to the corpse theater, oh yes, it's coming. Let's take a moment to appreciate the tragic irony of it all. Formosus spent half his career exiled, then clawed his way back, survived political backlash, and managed to become pope, only to end up even more controversial post-mortem. The 9th century, as it turns out, really doesn't believe in resting in peace. Here's where things get extra weird. After Formosus' death, a pope named Boniface VI takes over. For all up to weeks, historians still argue whether Boniface died of gout, poison, or a good old-fashioned mob ousting. His reign is like the medieval version of a loading screen here for a blink. Gone just as fast. Then comes Pope Stephen VI. And this, dear listener, is where our tale slips from unlucky pope into what even is happening anymore. The reasons, a bit murky. Some scholars say Stephen was under pressure from Lambert's faction. Others suspect personal bitterness, maybe a simmering resentment from when Formosus was still alive and appointing bishops left and right, possibly including Stephen himself. If your old boss once demoted you and then died, how far would you go for revenge? You're probably thinking, sure, he hated him, but he's dead. What can you even do to a corpse? Welcome to the Cadaver Synod. But before we roll the Gurnian, let's pause for one truly strange detail. In this time period, people genuinely believed that desecrating or punishing a body could affect a soul's fate. If you condemned someone after death, it wasn't just a grotesque PR stunt, it was believed to revoke their spiritual status, undo their official acts, and possibly even torment them in the afterlife. Yes, this was the papal version of delete their account. Here's the logistics part, and brace yourself. Stephen orders Formosus' corpse to be dug up. This is not weeks after burial. This is months. It's Rome. It's summer. You don't need to imagine too hard how that smells. The corpse is reportedly dressed in full papal regalia robes, crown, the whole pageant. It's then propped up on a throne in the Lateran Basilica. Some accounts say it's tied in place. Others suggest there was an unlucky deacon standing behind it, physically holding the remains upright like the worst ventriloquist act of all time. One mainstream fact: the trial took place in early 897 inside the Basilica of St. John Lateran, Rome's oldest and most prestigious church. Think of it as the spiritual center of the Christian world and now home to a posthumous legal circus. The crowd, silent, confused, maybe a little traumatized. The clergy, muted and miserable. You picture the scene: flickering torches, stale incense, and in the center, a corpse slowly collapsing under its own weight while an angry pope yells accusations. Historians still argue whether this was meant to appease Lambert's political faction, to solidify Stephen's control, or if Stephen had genuinely gone off the rails mentally. Could be all three. People are complicated. Popes, even more so. But one thing is clear: this moment burns itself into the medieval psyche. Because it's not just grotesque, it's incomprehensibly official. Stephen VI acts as both prosecutor and judge. The charges: that Formosus wasn't eligible to be pope, that he lied under oath, and get this, that he continued to function as a bishop after being excommunicated years before. Which, if true, would mean that everything he did as pope, like ordaining bishops, was invalid. This was a theological nuclear strike. To make it even weirder, Stephen appoints a deacon to speak on behalf of the corpse. That's right, someone's job was literally to pretend to be a rotting pope and plead not guilty. You imagine the awkward pauses, the audience trying not to gag, the sheer weight of spiritual theater crashing down on everyone like a falling cathedral ceiling. It is, somehow, both terrifying and darkly hilarious. One fringe tidbit: later rumors claim that Formosus' corpse groaned during the trial. Groaned out, was it gases? Was it stage fright from beyond the grave? No one knows, but someone definitely had nightmares. When the trial ends, the verdict is preordained: guilty. The corpse is stripped of its robes, 3 fingers used for blessings are chopped off, and his body is dragged through the streets like trash. Then is tossed into a common grave. And then, for good measure, thrown into the Tiber River. But we'll float downstream with him later. Right now, you sit with the image of a man who tried to lead his church through chaos, only to become the main character in history's most infamous corpse trial. And somehow, this isn't even the end of the story. Not for Formosus, not for Stephen, not for you. You're still in the Basilica, aren't you? Still picturing that slumped figure dressed in papal finery, propped up like the world's most tragic puppet. You're probably wondering, how did things get that bad? How does a dead pope end up on trial, in public, in full ceremonial drag, surrounded by Rome's clerical elite pretending that this is perfectly normal? Well, let's rewind just a touch, because we can't blame everything on Stephen VI, not entirely. This started long before his papacy, with layers of resentment baked into the weird, chewy crust of 9th century church politics. You've already met Pope John VIII, the one who had beef with Formosus early on. This wasn't just office gossip, this was a full-blown ecclesiastical showdown. John VIII accused Formosus of abandoning his post, conspiring with rebels, and plotting to seize the papacy. Harsh stuff, and while historians still argue whether Formosus actually wanted the papal throne, back then, the political climate was so unstable that just being competent made you look suspicious. Formosus had the misfortune of being a respected diplomat at a time when popes were increasingly anxious about rivals, especially those with connections to powerful nobles outside of Rome. He had friends in the Frankish courts, he had fans, and in an age where popularity could kill. That was enough to get him excommunicated. Remember that exile we talked about? It lasted several years. Formosus wandered the edges of power like a ghost, writing letters, pleading for forgiveness, and occasionally trying not to get murdered in the woods. Eventually, he was allowed back. John VIII died, murdered by his own inner circle, allegedly by blinding and hammer. Yeah, let's just say job. Security was not a Vatican strong suit back then. Fast forward a few short years, and Formosus has navigated the rocky road back to Rome, become Pope himself, and, in a spectacularly bold move, throws his support behind Arnulf of Carinthia, a Frankish king with imperial ambitions. Now, here's where things get really spicy. Arnulf was a threat to Lambert of Spoleto, the young co-emperor at the time, and Lambert's mother. A Geltrude was the kind of woman who probably kept a list of enemies in her Bible. Formosus' decision to crown Arnulf Holy Roman Emperor in 896 was basically a middle finger to Lambert's claim and to Spoleto's influence in Rome. One mainstream historical fact: when Formosus crowned Arnulf, he was hoping for a strong northern ally to stabilize the region and push back against local lords. Instead, Arnulf fell ill shortly after the coronation and had to retreat, leaving Formosus politically exposed. Oops. This move might have made strategic sense at the time, but it made him a dead man walking in the eyes of the Spoletan faction. And when he literally became a dead man, well, they saw their chance. Historians still debate just how much Geltrude and Lambert influenced Pope Stephen VI. Was he their puppet? Their pawn? Or did he just sincerely loathe Formosus enough to go full necrolegal? It's hard to say. One account suggests Stephen had once been appointed bishop by Formosus, and that this appointment was legally dicey, possibly even illegal under church law. That meant Stephen's entire career rested on shaky ground. Unless he could invalidate everything Formosus ever did. There's the motive. The medieval church had this fascinating rule called the canonical penalty of translation. It basically said that if you were a bishop, you weren't allowed to switch dioceses. Your post was for life, like a really claustrophobic lease agreement. Formosus had been Bishop of Porto before becoming Pope, technically a no-no. And here's the kicker: if his papacy was invalid, then all the bishops he ordained were invalid too, including Stephen. So, by putting his predecessor on trial, Stephen could do a little historical laundry. Oh no, he might have said, theatrically, that pope was never legitimate, and therefore, I'm not illegally promoted. See? All good. Let's move on. Every sentence is a hammer blown not just against Formosus, but against the bishops he ordained, the alliances he forged, and the legacy he tried to leave. And yet, it's also fragile. Stephen might have won the trial, but the damage to the church's image was catastrophic. Even in an age of vendettas, corpse trials were not considered good PR. Rumors spread quickly. Priests whispered in corners. Pilgrims raised eyebrows. The people of Rome, used to plenty of scandal, were visibly shaken. You get the sense that even they knew a line had been crossed, because while the church had seen excommunications, anathemas, and a few wrong pope moments before, no one had ever dug up a pontiff and dragged him to court. That was new, and not in a fun way. So now, as Formosus' broken body lies humiliated, stripped, and mutilated, Rome begins to grumble. The trial might have achieved its purpose on paper, but in the hearts of the faithful, it planted a very different seed. A quiet fury, the kind that grows in shadows, and soon, it's going to erupt. You wake up in Rome, figuratively. The sun cuts through narrow alleys, glinting off broken tiles and crumbling aqueducts, and somewhere out there, the Tiber carries secrets, perhaps even a pope. The Cadaver Synod is barely over, but already the mood in the city has curdled. The people aren't just whispering anymore. They're murmuring loud enough that Stephen VI probably needs thicker doors. You can almost hear them talking in the streets. Did you see it? My cousin says the corpse sat up. Blasphemy. He cursed the whole city, and in every tavern and bathhouse, over stale bread and sour wine. Someone is retelling the tale, adding a little extra rot, a little more horror. Because people love a scandal, but they love a villain downfall even more. Stephen VI, flushed with triumph, doesn't see it yet. Or maybe he does, and like a man in a sinking boat, he just keeps rowing faster. He's issued decrees nullifying everything Formosus ever did. Ordinations, Ruins, land grants all gone. It's like hitting undo on a dead man's resume. The church, in theory, has been purified only. It hasn't. You know how paper-thin the kind of justice feels, when all it takes is a louder voice or a bigger sword to rewrite the rules. And the Roman clergy? They're over it. Their fingers are stained with ink and wax from validating Formosus' decisions just months earlier. Now they're being told to erase everything, swear new oaths, unbless previously blessed things. One bishop quips, "What next? Baptize the dead." That's not in a source, but you can almost hear it, can't you? One mainstream historical fact: the backlash to the Cadaver Synod came quickly and fiercely. Rome, already used to popes getting ousted, poisoned, and mysteriously vanished, found this to be a step too far. Desecrating a body was not just gory, it was spiritually reckless. It spooked people. Some believed that condemning a pope posthumously could curse the church itself. That belief, it catches fire. The elite start to panic, not for spiritual reasons, come on. They're politicians, but because the mob is starting to stir. Rome is no stranger to political riots, bread shortages, bad harvests. Too many taxes people have rioted over far less than a zombified pope being humiliated in church. So the whispers sharpen, eyes turn on Stephen, and then, with the kind of speed that would make a Netflix drama seem slow-paced, the walls cave in. A coup. A messy, late-night, probably not quite legal coup. Historians still argue whether this was orchestrated by outraged clergy, disillusioned nobles, or just regular citizens who had reached their absolute limit with all the corpse drama. Probably all three. Rome's factions are always overlapping like badly drawn Venn diagrams. Stephen. VI is arrested. Imagine that scene. The once commanding pope now being dragged through the same. Paul's where he screamed at a dead man. He's thrown in a dank prison, stripped of power, abandoned by the very people who cheered him just months earlier. It doesn't end well. He dies in that cell, strangled under mysterious circumstances. Mysterious being the medieval word for we know who did it. We just aren't writing it down. One fringe tidbit: some legends claim the priest who presided at Formosus' trial also died under equally strange conditions, suggesting a divine curse was in play. Or just Rome doing Rome things. So now you have two dead popes. One murdered, one mutilated. Both the center of the same fevered story. And it doesn't stop there. Because the backlash to the Cadaver Synod doesn't just topple Stephen, it reverses his decrees. Like a pendulum swing, the next pope, Romanus, who steps in briefly, tries to calm things down. He doesn't exactly throw a party in Formosus' honor, but he quietly annals Stephen's actions and revalidates all those disrupted ordinations. The message is clear. Let's just pretend none of it happened. But Romanus doesn't last. Power is still shifting, and within months, he's gone, replaced by Theodore II. A name you probably haven't heard, but should absolutely remember. Because Theodore II, he does something wild. He finds Formosus' body. That's right. Remember how it got dumped into the Tiber? Somehow miraculously. According to some, the body is recovered. Still in one piece, if you can believe it. Maybe snagged on a reed bed. Maybe pulled out by some brave fisherman with a strong stomach and a loose sense of boundaries. One mainstream account from the Liber Pontificalis claims Theodore ordered Formosus' body to be reburied with full honors in St. Peter's Basilica, a symbolic act. A papal apology without the actual sorry. Imagine that scene in another funeral, this time solemn, maybe a bit theatrical. Priests whispering Latin rites, incense trying to cover the unmistakable smell of river rot. Historians still debate whether the body was really intact, whether it was the real body, or if this was a symbolic gesture using bones from someone else. But for the church, it didn't matter. What mattered was undoing the scandal, repairing the image, moving on, that sort of. Because even now, the ghost of Formosus lingers. He's no longer just a pope. He's become a symbol of corruption, of injustice, of the twisted ways that power can reshape history. And you, floating through this sleepy narrative, can feel it too. That tug of something unresolved. That tension between truth and theater. Between legacy and revenge. One more twist after Theodore II. Yet another pope rises, John the Ninth, who takes the cleanup even further. He holds synods, yes, more meetings, to officially ban trials of the dead. You'd think that wouldn't need to be spelled out. But when you've got corpses in court, it's probably time to revise the rulebook. John X also reaffirms all of Formosus' acts as legitimate. He's trying very hard to stabilize things, bring the pendulum to rest in the middle, and maybe you can let out the breath you didn't know you were holding. Because while the Cadaver Synod is over, and the players have either died, vanished, or retired awkwardly, the legend is just beginning. You're drifting now, gliding gently over the rooftops of medieval Rome, where stone towers lean like tired sentinels and ivy claws up cracked walls like nature trying to reclaim the drama. The city is quieter now, or at least pretending to be. Stephen VI is dead. Theodore II made peace with a corpse, and John the Ninth has tried to mop up the mess with a synod and some wishful decrees. But you know Rome, it never sleeps for long, and neither do its grudges, because somewhere in this deeply confusing papal relay race, where everyone keeps tripping over the last guy's corpse, there's a young man watching, waiting, smoldering with all the righteous fury of a teenager, who thinks they've been wronged by literally everyone. His name, Lambert of Spoleto. Remember him? The co-emperor who Formosus snubbed by crowning Arnulf instead. Yeah, that Lambert. Still very much alive. Still angry. And despite the blow dealt to his family's influence, he is not quite done yet. One mainstream historical fact, Lambert and his mother, a Geltrude, were deeply enmeshed in Roman politics. A Geltrude in particular wielded considerable influence over clerics and nobles alike, and her name pops up in several suspicious papal transitions. It's not too far-fetched to imagine her sipping wine in a candlelit room, whispering to bishops about loyalty, legacy, and revenge. Lambert may have lost the imperial crown, but that didn't mean he couldn't shape history. And shaping history in the 9th century meant one thing: reshuffling the papacy, like it was a particularly cursed deck of cards. So, not long after John the Ninth tries to settle everything, surprise, he dies. Because of course he does. Popes are about as stable in this era as your Wi-Fi during a thunderstorm. Cue the entrance of Pope Benedict IV, a name that doesn't inspire much awe but marks another round of uneasy peace. He actually tries to support Lambert's authority while also not reigniting corpse-related drama. It's a delicate dance, and for a brief moment, it works. Except, guess what? He dies. At this point, it's almost a running joke. If you're elected pope in the late 800s, you might as well start digging your own grave on day one. They don't give you a ring, they give you a shovel. Now here's where things go from grim to absolutely Monty Python. Enter Pope Sergius III. Well, re-enter. Technically, he had tried for the papacy earlier, lost out, and bided his time. But with Rome still quaking from post-Senate tension, he senses his moment. Supported by a rising Roman noble family, the Crescenzio clan, Sergius slides into power in 904. After a bloody struggle that involved the imprisonment and possible assassination of his rival, Pope Christopher. Fringe tidbit: some historians argue that Pope Christopher may have been imprisoned, deposed, and possibly murdered by Sergius himself. Others claim Christopher wasn't a legitimate pope at all, just a papal squatter. There's even debate about whether he was officially recognized. It's the ecclesiastical version of Who's on the Lease. That the whole dead pope on trial circus was perfectly reasonable. Thank you very much. It's like watching someone pull a skeleton out of the closet, then slap it on the pulpit and yell, "Told you so." Either way, Sergius sets a dangerous precedent. The church is supposed to be a pillar of order, of spiritual continuity, and yet here it is, waffling back and forth over a dead man's reputation like it's debating brunch options. Meanwhile, outside the Vatican walls, Rome is shifting. You've got noble families, the Cresceni and the Theophylax, rising in power. basically turning the papacy into a family business. These groups don't just influence who becomes pope, they control it outright. And Sergius is their first big win. He's more of a client than a cleric, a puppet with a mitre. Under Sergius, corruption flourishes. He promotes allies, crushes dissent, and settles old scores with a kind of bitter satisfaction. Rumors fly that he even fathers a son, John XI, with the notorious Marozia, daughter of Theophylact of Tusculum. Marozia will become one of the most powerful women in papal history. But that's a story for another night, one with even more betrayals and questionable parentage. Right now, all you need to know is this: the papacy is no longer just a spiritual office. It's a chess piece, and the board is crawling with nobles who drink wine from goblets and poison from rings. So even though Formosus is long dead, his trial still echoes through every dark corridor of Rome. Every papal decision now comes with a question: are you loyal to the dead pope, or the one who dragged him from his tomb? Because here's the quiet truth: power doesn't forget, and neither does Rome. You, gently tumbling through these events like a feather in a storm, can feel the unease curling around the edges of the narrative. There's no tidy ending here, no simple moral, just a city haunted by a man who won't stay buried and leaders who keep trying to rewrite what his life meant and what his death demanded. By now, you're probably wondering, did anything ever calm down? Does the carousel of popes, grudges, and semi-resurrected corpses ever slow to a gentle spin? The short answer, sort of. But first, let's step back not just in time, but in temperature. Because Rome, in the early 900s, is simmering. Not just from the sun baking its cobblestones, but from the low, constant burn of political ambition. Everywhere you turn, someone is plotting to marry their daughter into the right family, bribe the right cardinal, or throw a pope off a balcony. And here's where it gets a little unholy. The papacy, at this point, has become the crown jewel of Roman politics. Not a spiritual refuge, not a beacon of moral guidance, but a tool, a scepter, a weapon to be handed from family to family like a really cursed heirloom. Which brings us to a particularly juicy phase of history. Known, brace yourself, as the Saeculum Obscurum, Latin for the Dark Age, or, if you want to be spicy about it, the pornocracy. At the center of it all, Marozia, daughter of Theophylact of Tusculum, and rumored lover of Pope Sergius III. Let it settle in for a second. The same pope who reinstated the Cadaver Synod may have fathered a child with a woman, whose family was literally puppeteering the Vatican. Their son, the future Pope John XI. Yes, a pope possibly born out of a scandalous affair between a power-hungry noblewoman and the guy who once cheered on a corpse trial. Sleepy yet? Here's the fringe tidbit you didn't ask for, but now can't unhear. Some medieval sources claim that Marozia ran Rome like a mafia boss in silk slippers. She placed and removed popes like she was changing outfits. Others went further, describing her palace as more decadent than a Frankish king's court with lovers, feasts, and backdoor baptisms. Of course, historians still argue whether Marozia was truly the iron-fisted mastermind she's portrayed as, or just the scapegoat of a deeply misogynistic clerical record. After all, it's very convenient to blame a woman for everything when things go sideways, especially one who didn't stay quietly in the shadows. Still, no matter how much scholarly doubt you sprinkle on top, one truth rises from the stew. During these decades, the papacy was a prize, and whoever controlled it, whether through marriage, murder, or motherhood, held the keys to heaven and Rome. Which brings us back to Formosus. You may think his story is done. His bones are back in St. Peter's, his honor half repaired, and the people who tried him are long dead or very imprisoned. But in a strange way, his trial becomes a blueprint for everything that follows. The Cadaver Synod proved one thing: reputation can be put on trial just as easily as the man himself. And once the door opened, Rome never fully closed it. Each new pope had to navigate the sins of the last three. Each decision weighed against the ghost of Formosus, who, let's be real, never asked for any of this. Imagine being a quiet bishop who just wanted to retire to the countryside, and suddenly your corpse is on trial for treason and witchcraft. You'd be haunting everyone too. You float now through the years, where popes blink in and out of office like broken light bulbs. Many reign for only months, some are elected by force, others bribed in. One, famously, is a mere teenager when crowned a puppet on a velvet throne. That's Pope John XII, Marosia's grandson. He ascends the papacy at around age 18 and turns the Lateran Palace into what one monk described as a brothel for the devil. We won't linger on the Jewish year accusations, because this is bedtime, not HBO, but suffice it to say, when you're the young and the powerful in a city that's already spiritually unmoored, it doesn't end in sainthood. The Cadaver Synod doesn't get repeated, but its energy never leaves. It hovers like incensed smoke, a reminder that spiritual authority can be twisted into theater. That justice, especially posthumous justice, can serve any narrative. And it whispers to every new pope, careful who you bury. Someone might dig them back up. Historians still argue whether the Cadaver Synod was an aberration or the moment the papacy lost its moral high ground for good. Some see it as a fever spike in an already sick institution. Others as the start of a long, humiliating collapse, one that would take centuries and countless reforms to correct. But you're just coasting through the ruins now, watching the flickering torches of history illuminate one absurdity after another. And as strange as it all is, there's something oddly comforting in it. Human ambition, after all, doesn't change. Whether in a velvet robe or a pizza-stained hoodie, people will always wrestle for power, justify their worst decisions, and sometimes put a corpse on trial to prove a point, and then rewrite the ending dot again and again. You're still here, tucked under your blanket, the hum of your fan blending with the crickets of imagined Roman gardens. And outside your dream window, the eternal city sighs, restless as ever. Because even in the darkest decades, Rome never sleeps at plots. But let's pause the carnage for just a second. Not because things are getting better, no, but because the papacy is about to hit a strange kind of equilibrium. And like any good horror movie, the eerie silence only means something worse is coming. So who's at the wheel now? Well, after the mess left by John XII, the teenage pope whose hobbies reportedly included hunting, drinking, and inviting his horse into sacred meetings, we enter an age that's, well, slightly more predictable. Emphasis on slightly. The noble families are still the true puppet masters, but at least the puppets are less openly debauched, for a while. Here's the mainstream historical fact to anchor us. From the mid-10th to early 11th centuries, the papacy falls heavily under the control of the Counts of Tusculum, a branch of the same noble family that brought us Marozia. Yep, the saga continues. These guys churn out popes like a bakery on a feast day. If your last name is Tusculum and you've got a pulse, you're in the running. In fact, Pope Benedict IX, one of the later Tusculum popes, holds the papacy 3 separate times. Not 3 terms back to back. No, he resigns, is kicked out, comes back, leaves again, sells the papacy, we'll get to that, and then comes back again. It's basically a holy game of musical chairs. Now here's the fringe tidbit, and it's a doozy. During one of those resignations, Benedict IX is believed to have literally sold the papacy to his godfather, Gregory VI, in 1045. Yes, like a used car, or a particularly cursed blender. According to some accounts, Benedict was just tired of being pope and wanted to get married, so he offered the office to the highest bidder. One historian later described this period as the low point of papal history, which is hilarious, considering it comes after the Cadaver Synod. Apparently, digging up a corpse isn't as bad as just flipping the papacy for quick cash. But let's keep our eyes on the spiritual horizon, shall we? Because while Rome flails through popes and power grabs, something is stirring up north, a slow, rumbling reform movement. Monks in distant monasteries begin whispering that maybe, just maybe, the papacy should be about, faith, Maybe the Pope shouldn't be a teenage frat bro or a walking real estate deal. Maybe the office should be, dare we say it, sacred again. Cue the rise of the Cluniac reforms, a movement within the church that emphasizes monastic discipline, independence from lay control, and spiritual renewal. These reforms begin in the early 900s in the Abbey of Cluny in France and gradually ripple across Europe like warm water spilling from a bowl. And Rome takes forever to notice, but notice it eventually does. Historians still argue whether the Cluniac influence ever truly broke through the Tusculum grip, or simply inspired later reformers to act. But it's hard to deny that these distant monks, kneeling in candlelight and reciting psalms, were planting seeds for something far bigger, a future where popes might actually be respected again. For now, though, Rome is still teetering. Remember Pope Benedict IX? That chaotic papal boomerang? Well, his mess sets the stage for one of the most quietly important popes of the medieval era, Pope Leo IX, elected in 1049. He's not a puppet. He's not from a Roman noble house, and he doesn't need to be bribed or begged into office. He's a reformer, and he takes the job seriously. And here's the twist. Pope Leo IX sees the long shadow of the Cadaver Synod, still hanging over the papacy. Not literally no one's digging up Formosus again, but the idea of using the papal office as a tool of vengeance, that still lingers. Leo starts pushing back hard. He demands clerical celibacy, cracks down on simony, that's the selling of church offices, in case you missed it, and begins centralizing papal authority. He wants to purify the church, and maybe, finally, he's strong enough to do it. But of course, Rome doesn't just roll over. You still have noble families, still have squabbles over succession, and yes, still have whispers in the alleys of what happened to Formosus. His bones may be dust, but his story, it's become a legend, a warning, a parable for anyone who dares sit in the chair of St. Peter and think their deeds won't be judged even after death. You drift quietly now through candlelit halls and smoky chambers, where bishops argue over doctrine and nobles argue over dinner seating. The smell of incense mingles with burnt garlic and paranoia. And somewhere, maybe, there's a statue of Formosus carved stone eyes watching every new pope like he knows their secrets. And maybe he does. Because in Rome, history isn't buried. It's embalmed, propped up, and paraded through the streets for everyone to gawk at. And sometimes, if you listen closely to it speaks, you're still floating through Rome like a very sleepy ghost, with front row seats to the slow motion unraveling, and occasional restitching of the medieval papacy. The streets smell like bread, sweat, and politics. And above you, the looming dome of St. Peter's casts no shadow of comfort, just pressure. Centuries of it. Let's linger here, because we're on the edge of a cliff. A quiet, Roman prelude to one of the most dramatic shakeups in church history. And all roads now point towards something called the investiture controversy. Doesn't exactly sound thrilling, does it? Like a debate over insurance plans or who gets to wear the fanciest hat. But trust me, this thing turns into a political MMA cage match. Here's your mainstream historical fact. The investiture controversy, which kicks off in the late 11th century, is a power struggle between popes and kings, especially between Pope Gregory VII and Holy Roman Emperor Henry IV. At its heart, a deceptively simple question. Who gets to appoint bishops the church or the state? Seems like a niche issue, right? But in a world where bishops control vast lands and wealth, appointing them isn't just a religious formality. It's the medieval equivalent of picking governors, generals, and tax collectors all at once. Kings wanted control. Popes, increasingly emboldened by reformers like Leo IX and Gregory VII, wanted independence. So, naturally, everything catches fire. Pope Gregory VII isn't just some quiet monk with big dreams. He's fiery, unapologetic, and ready to go toe-to-toe with emperors. In 1075, he issues a document called Dictatus Papae, a list of statements asserting papal supremacy. One of them says the Pope can depose emperors. Another says the Pope can't be judged by anyone ever, even if he accidentally drops the Eucharist or starts humming in the middle of a Mass. And here's your fringe tidbit. Gregory VII may have been the first Pope to formally claim that the Pope is the universal judge of all mankind. A big claim for a guy who used to be a deacon in a monastery where silence was the vibe. Naturally, this doesn't sit well with Henry IV. He's the Holy Roman Emperor, not some church intern. So he tells Gregory to take a long walk off a shore cathedral. And Gregory, he excommunicates him. Like, boom, no sacraments, no spiritual protection, no legitimacy. It's the medieval equivalent of getting kicked off the internet, blacklisted from every social circle, and ghosted by God all at once. Now, this is the part where it gets cinematic. Henry IV, suddenly panicking that his nobles will abandon him, marches across the Alps in the dead of winter. He arrives at Canossa, where Pope Gregory is staying, and stands barefoot in the snow for 3 days, begging for forgiveness. Yes, a king in the snow, no shoes, crying. Historians still argue whether this moment at Canossa was a genuine act of penance or a brilliant PR stunt. Some say Henry was truly broken. Others say he just wanted to survive long enough to regroup and then pounce. Which he does. After being forgiven, Henry goes back to Germany, gathers an army, and eventually drives Gregory into exile. The papacy, in an ironic twist, ends up weakened again. So much for being judge of mankind. But the real takeaway? This whole conflict exposes how fragile the spiritual weight of the papacy has become. Because even though the church wants to project divine authority, everyone knows the truth. It's still about control, land, loyalty, leverage. And somehow, even with all this swirling chaos, the memory of Formosus still lingers. Because the Cadaver Synod set a precedent that even popes dead or alive are fair game for public judgment. And whether you're excommunicating an emperor or declaring your own supremacy, that ghost is always in the room. Imagine Gregory pacing his chambers by candlelight, knowing full well that if things go south, someone could still dig him up someday, rewrap his bones, question his decrees, turn his papacy into performance art, just like poor Formosus. But that's the thing about power. It's never stable, especially not in Rome. For every Gregory, there's a Henry. For every holy vision, a political nightmare. You might win the snowstorm showdown, but you still have to make it through spring. And if you're wondering whether this epic tug-of-war leads to lasting change, well, yes and no. Eventually, the investiture controversy ends with a compromise in 1122 called the Concordat of Worms. Don't giggle, it's pronounced Worms. The church gets the final say on spiritual appointments, but kings can still influence things. It's like a messy custody agreement where both parents pretend to get along for the kid's sake. And Rome moves on that sort of. The city keeps simmering. Popes still come and go. Some are reformers. Others are opportunists. A few are saintly. One or two probably couldn't spell celibacy if you spotted them the first 6 letters. But the drama of Formosus and the spectacle of the Cadaver Synod? That story remains a deep wrinkle in the papal robe. A cautionary tale whispered in Latin. Proof that no matter how holy your throne, human hands still pull the strings. And somewhere, maybe in the shadow of the Lateran, a statue's blank eyes still watch, quiet and blinking. You stretch, the fan hums, Rome flickers behind your eyelids, and the next chapter waits. So you're still here, still drifting through the incense and intrigue of medieval Rome, where every pope has a rival, and every rival might end up excommunicated or worse, embalmed as a political statement. Sleep may be tugging at your eyelids, but Rome's drama isn't done with you yet. And tonight, the spotlight shifts, because while the dust from the investiture controversy settles into something resembling compromise, the papacy starts thinking bigger, not just about bishops and emperors anymore. No, now it's looking outward toward the rest of Christendom, and even beyond. Enter the Crusades. Your mainstream historical fact here. In 1095, Pope Urban II gives a speech at the Council of Clermont, calling on Christians to take up arms and reclaim the Holy Land from Muslim control. That speech ignites the First Crusade, and the world changes. Just like that, imagine 1,000 torches flaring up across Europe, peasants and knights alike dropping everything: lives, farms, debts, and heading off on a holy road trip that's equal parts devotion and destruction. Some see it as salvation, others as a sanctioned land grab with bonus sins cleansed. And at the center of it all, Pope Urban, high on rhetoric, practically inventing the concept of religious warfare. God wills it, he cries. And just like that, the papacy morphs from Rome's troubled bishopric into the moral compass of all Christendom with a sword. Now, here's your quirky tidbit. During these crusading centuries, popes sometimes sent out blessed battle standards, essentially holy flags that armies would carry into war. One was said to have pieces of St. Peter's chains woven into it. Another allegedly contained a splinter from the true cross, like a divine cheat code. Of course, these relics were more about morale than miracle. But still, imagine being a weary knight, caked in dust, staring at a flag and believing heaven itself is your back. It's like medieval branding, with extra blood. But as popes become military influencers, something interesting happens. The memory of Formosus, the dead pope, paraded and judged, starts to feel inconvenient. Because how do you lead a holy war when people still remember the time? The papacy dragged the corpse through court. So, slowly, quietly, Rome begins rewriting its own story. Documents from the 9th and 10th centuries go missing. Others get revised. The Vatican doesn't like to talk about Formosus anymore. No anniversary masses, no statues, no subtle nods and theological debates. It's like he never existed, except he did, and his story clings to the corners of the papal palace like old soot. Historians still argue whether this selective silence was deliberate erasure or just collective embarrassment. Either way, it's a little like pretending your weird uncle never crashed a wedding with karaoke and fireworks Jay. Used a little awkward to bring up, even centuries later. But Rome can't outrun its shadow, especially not now. Because the Crusades, while dramatic and deeply spiritual in theory, spiral into chaos. Armies pillage Christian cities, emperors clash with popes again, and somewhere in the mix, the papacy starts looking less like the moral leader of Europe, and more like just another political player in an increasingly violent game. And the irony? Just like the Cadaver Synod was meant to destroy Formosus' legacy but ended up immortalizing him. The Crusades were supposed to purify the church's purpose, but they do the opposite. Greed, power, and mismanagement rear their heads with alarming speed. There's even a moment your sleep brain might not believe this when crusaders from the west sacked Constantinople, the capital of Eastern Christianity, in 1204. Yep, Christians on Christians. Because when religious fervor meets poor planning, bad things happen. And through it all, the Pope watches, sometimes cheering, sometimes weeping, occasionally hiding. Which brings us back to Formosus, in spirit at least. Because deep down, his ghost still haunts this entire medieval experiment. He was the papacy's cautionary tale. The line that, once crossed, proved that no office, no matter how sacred, is safe from scandal. By now, Rome has become a place where memory is curated like a museum collection. Some events are polished and displayed. Others are locked in dusty cabinets, preferably forgotten. But the Cadaver Synod? You can't unring that bell. The whispered legacy becomes a subtle undercurrent, even in papal reform. Think of it like a bad tattoo the church tries to cover up with fresher ink. But under the surface? Still there. Still visible, if you squint in the right light. And as the popes march onward, now leading armies, blessing conquests, haggling with kings, you start to wonder, has anything really changed? Sure, no one's putting corpses on trial. Not yet. But the hunger for power? The theatrical gestures? The sacred posturing covering deeply human flaws? Still here. Still Rome. Still the papacy. Tangi, you're drifting again. Through echoing cathedrals and war camps. Through torchlit parades and secret scribes editing history books by candlelight. You pass a hallway with marble busts, one missing its plaque. Maybe Formosus. Maybe someone else they'd rather you forget. But you remember, and somewhere, in your dream-addled mind, the weight of history settles like dust on an altar. The fan hums. The lights dim just a little more. Rome rolls on. So, you're still gliding through history, half awake, half hypnotized by the strange rhythm of it all. Rome, in its nightgown of marble and incense, never really sleeps. And neither, it seems, does its legacy of papal chaos. Now, while crusading popes are busy carving the cross into foreign lands, something else starts bubbling back home. The idea of a supremely untouchable papal office. Like, really untouchable. Above kings, above councils, above criticism. The Pope isn't just the Bishop of Rome anymore, he's being cast as the Vicar of Christ. The literal stand-in for Jesus on earth. Imagine if your manager at work decided their role had divine implications. It's the kind of vibe. Confident, wildly ambitious, and about to unravel in deliciously ironic fashion. Your mainstream historical fact tonight, in 1302, Pope Boniface VIII issues a papal bull called Unum Sanctam, which boldly states that submission to the Pope is necessary for salvation. Basically, obey me or go to hell, casual. Now Boniface is a character, arrogant, theatrical, and maybe just maybe a little off his rocker. He once reportedly said, "I am Caesar. I am emperor," not exactly humble priest energy. Here's your quirky tidbit. Boniface VIII once staged a giant self-coronation, with a literal two-crown hat, while riding a white horse and tossing coins into the crowd like medieval Oprah. You get a blessing. You get a blessing. Everyone gets indulgences. Philip starts flexing royal power, taxing the clergy, and essentially treating the Pope like a rogue bishop from the provinces. Boniface is furious. He excommunicates Philip. Philip laughs, then sends an army. Yes, you heard that right. In 1303, a group of mercenaries sent by Philip actually kidnaps the Pope at his summer palace in Anagni. They slap him around, drag him off, and plan to bring him back to France for trial. Sound familiar? Historians still argue whether this was meant to echo the Cadaver Synod, as a deliberate throwback to the time a pope was publicly humiliated and tried. It might have been political poetry, or just a coincidence soaked in irony. Either way, it was a brutal reminder that the church still danced to worldly tunes. Boniface is eventually freed, but the damage is done. He dies shortly after, humiliated and broken. The Pope who claimed ultimate authority ends up battered by hired goons. Divine mandate, meet brass knuckles, and from this cracked throne, the papacy enters what historians lovingly call the Avignon papacy, or, if you prefer, the Babylonian captivity of the church. The great basilicas fall into disrepair. Pilgrims stop visiting. The fountains run dry. The pigeons unionize. And the papacy? Well, it becomes more like a royal court, lavish, political, and very French. The church, once centered around martyrdom and spiritual purity, now hosts feasts with swan pate and questionable wine pairings. Formosus still absent from every conversation. His legacy still whispered, never named. Like that old family scandal you just don't bring up at dinner. But you can't help but wonder if those French popes, lounging in their velvet robes, ever thought of him. Of that time, Rome judged one of its own in public. A shadow over the throne they now held at a distance. But don't get too cozy, because this French vacation doesn't last forever. In 1377, Pope Gregory XI finally returns the papacy to Rome. A noble effort, but one that backfires immediately. Because when Gregory dies, Rome demands an Italian pope. The cardinals, pressured by angry mobs, elect Urban VI, a man so fiery and erratic. The same cardinals later flee and elect a second pope, Clement VII, who sets up shop back in Avignon. Cue the Western Schism, a delightful period where the popes and later three claim to be the true pope. Excommunications are flying like angry birds, and no one can agree on who's in charge. The church becomes a spiritual version of the Parent Trap, with rival popes writing nasty letters, calling each other illegitimate, and trying to outholy one another. One even claims the other is literally possessed. Demonic possession, the medieval version of a character assassination. It's absurd, embarrassing, and spiritually exhausting for average believers. Historians still argue whether this multi-pope mess was the final nail in the papacy's credibility coffin, or just a particularly awkward midlife crisis. Either way, it breaks something deep. People start questioning the whole idea of papal authority. Not just which pope to follow, but why follow any. It'll take a big OL council, the Council of Constance, to be exact, to clean this up in the early 1400s. They finally deponify all the rival claimants and elect a single pope, Martin V. Order restored, technically, but the trust fractured, the mystique a little more tattered, and the memory of Formosus still buried, still there. Because as Rome continues to reinvent its sacred script, his story remains the smudged footnote, the embarrassing exception. A robed corpse, judged by his successor, still echoing through every papal misstep. You turn now in your bed, limbs heavy, eyes fluttering. Maybe you hear footsteps in a marble hall, or the rustle of papal robes behind a locked door. Or maybe it's just the fan, still humming, still carrying you forward. You're nearly halfway through the night. And Rome still has tricks up her sleeve. The room is still. The fan drones like a distant chant in the stone chapel, and you, wrapped in the velvet folds of half-sleep, drift deeper into Rome's strange, swirling saga. Because just when it seems the papacy might settle down, it doesn't. Rome, it turns out, is a city addicted to spectacle. And in this next act, we get back to a theme we know well by now: corpses, politics, and the deeply unsettling line between the living and the dead. You thought the Cadaver Synod was a one-time horror show, didn't you? Something Rome tried and failed, like an unfortunate menu item that never made it back after Lent. But nope. Turns out, the idea of judging the dead never really went away, it just evolved. Let's get your mainstream historical fact in early tonight. In the 15th century, a sharp new movement called conciliarism takes root. It's the belief that church councils, not the Pope, should have ultimate authority. This is radical and dangerous and very appealing after the whole multiple popes debacle. The Council of Constance, which ended the Great Schism, becomes a model for this idea. Why trust one guy with a fancy hat, the logic goes, when you can have a whole room of fancy hats sharing power? Makes sense. Checks and balances, but make it Latin. The popes, as you might imagine, are not fans. But as this new philosophy spreads, it gets tangled up with something older, darker, heresy trials. And suddenly, long dead thinkers, some forgotten, some revered, are being exhumed in memory. Their ideas dragged back into the light for posthumous judgment. No literal corpses in the courtroom this time. Not yet. But the spirit of the Cadaver Synod is alive and well. Here's your quirky tidbit. In 1415, the Council of Constance actually digs up the bones of the Czech reformer Jan Hus, years after burning him at the stake, and burns his remains again just to make sure. The man was dead. Charred. Ashes. And still, someone said, better give those another roast. That's commitment. Historians still argue whether this was genuine zeal or overcompensation for guilt. Either way, it's deeply unsettling and a bit absurd. You almost expect someone to start selling "I survived the second burning" t-shirts. And then, there's the matter of papal memory. See, during these centuries, the Vatican begins carefully managing its image, polishing the past like a tarnished chalice. Official chronicles are rewritten, softened, adjusted to favor whichever pope is currently in power. Saints are canonized with careful PR. Anti-popes are quietly edited out. You know the drill. But what happens when someone remembers the parts they were told to forget? Cue the 15th century humanists, those curious, sleep-deprived scholars who start digging through old Roman archives like historical raccoons. They stumble on weird, contradictory records. Mentions of a pope named Formosus, a corpse, a trial. Wait, what? Some of them write about it, tentatively. Others laugh it off as a bizarre rumor, the kind of story too ridiculous to be real. But a few lean in. One in particular, Platina, the Vatican librarian under Pope Sixtus IV, includes a very brief reference to the Cadaver Synod in his Lives of the Popes. A single paragraph, carefully neutral. It's the literary equivalent of saying, look, I didn't want to bring this up, but the Sistine Chapel becomes a monument not just to faith, but to ego. Rome isn't just holy anymore, it's fashionable. And the popes, they begin to act more like princes, collecting art, building palaces, throwing feasts. It's less about preaching and more about pageantry. Formosus, still not mentioned, still the uninvited guest at every coronation. But you sense his presence, don't you? Lurking beneath every jewel-studded mitre, behind every papal procession, like a murmur in the incense smoke. The body judged in death now judges the living through memory. Which brings us to one more delightful papal gaffe before your next REM cycle. Pope Alexander VI, also known as Rodrigo Borgia. Yes, those Borgias. The Renaissance version of a prestige TV drama, complete with poison rings and scandalous lovers. He becomes Pope in 1492, the same year Columbus sets sail, because time loves a good plot twist. Alexander is charming, politically brilliant, and arguably corrupt to the core. His papacy is soaked in nepotism, bribes, and bedroom intrigue. One of his more questionable acts, hosting lavish banquets in the Vatican, featuring hired dancers and fountains of wine. Some accounts dubious, but persistent even claim he held a naked chestnut hunting contest in the Apostolic Palace. Don't ask. The church, you'll be shocked to hear, doesn't look great during this time. And again, Formosus looms. Not in speech, not in record, but in implication. Because the Cadaver Synod showed the world that the papacy could be vengeful, theatrical, fallible. And every time a pope like Alexander goes full soap opera, the old skeleton rattles faintly in his tomb. A quiet warning, a reminder that no crown, no matter how holy, is immune to scandal. So now, as the moon slips behind a cloud and the walls of your room dissolve into frescoes and marble, you settle a little deeper into this strange history. It's still warm, still absurd, still Rome. And through it all, a whisper. You're moving now into the age where the Renaissance's sparkling light begins to reveal more shadows. Then it vanishes. You remember how the Borgias turned the Vatican into a stage for intrigue and excess. But the story doesn't end there. No. After Alexander VI, the papacy faces a new challenge, the rising tide of Reformation. Here's your historical fact. In 1517, a monk named Martin Luther nails his 95 Theses to a church door in Wittenberg, Germany, sparking religious upheaval across Europe. It's a challenge to papal authority unlike any before. Suddenly, the Pope isn't just a distant figure in Rome, he's the lightning rod for massive theological, political, and social change. And of course, Rome freaks out. But amidst this chaos, something strange happens. The story of Formosus the Pope, who was dug up and put on trial, starts to be used as a metaphor. Reformers and critics pull him from the shadows as an example of papal corruption and absurdity. His macabre trial becomes a symbol of everything wrong with church politics. Here's the quirky tidbit. Protestant pamphleteers in the 16th century published exaggerated and often grotesque versions of the Cadaver Synod story to mock the papacy. One even claimed the corpse of Formosus used its skeletal hand to curse his enemies, talk about an undead power move. Historians still argue whether these depictions were fair criticism or cheap propaganda. But either way, Formosus's posthumous trial gains new life in the cultural imagination. The robed corpse becomes less a forgotten oddity and more a legendary figure of papal absurdity. Meanwhile, back in Rome, the church tries to clean house with the Counter-Reformation. The Council of Trent 1545 to 1563 institutes reforms to address corruption and clarify doctrine. The papacy reasserts its authority, but now with a sharpened focus on image and discipline. Art and architecture flourish under popes like Pope Paul III, who commissions grand projects designed to awe and inspire. Michelangelo's Dome on St. Peter's Basilica begins to rise, a monument to renewed papal grandeur and divine power. Yet, the shadow of Formosus remains a whisper beneath the grandeur. His trial reminds Rome that the papacy's authority is always vulnerable to scandal and challenge. In quieter moments, you might imagine that skeleton's still waiting somewhere beneath the Vatican, a symbol that even the holiest office can be dragged, literally, through the mud. And as you breathe slower, the hum of your fan blends with distant echoes of chanting monks and the flicker of candlelight on stone walls. You're halfway through the night's journey now, wrapped in a tapestry woven of power, intrigue, and the strange rituals that make history so irresistibly human. The night deepens, and your eyelids grow heavier, but the story refuses to pause, flowing onward like the Tiber itself, sometimes calm, sometimes wild, always persistent. You're entering the era when the papacy embraces both its divine role and its very human foibles, with startling boldness. So, after the chaos of Reformation and Counter-Reformation, Rome settles into what might be called its Baroque phase, a time of grandiosity, drama, and dazzling excess. Think of it as the papacy's version of a rock concert, complete with dramatic lighting candles, elaborate costumes, robes heavy enough to weigh down a horse, and an endless encore of pomp. Your historical fact here is that Pope Urban VIII, 1623 to 1644, from the Barberini family, was a major patron of the arts and sciences. He famously supported Galileo early on, but later turned against him when the scientist's heliocentric theories ruffled church feathers. Urban VIII also commissioned Bernini to create some of the most famous sculptures in St. Peter's Basilica. On a quirkier note, Urban VIII also reportedly banned the use of peacock feathers in church decorations because they were associated with vanity and sin. Imagine that, a pope policing the peacock aesthetic. No peacocks at the Vatican Gala. Please. Historians still argue whether Urban VIII's clash with Galileo was driven by genuine theological concern or personal pride. Either way, it was a reminder that even during grand artistic flourish, the church was wrestling with its relationship to knowledge and power. Back to Formosus for a moment. His posthumous trial had become a symbol of papal absurdity, but now the papacy was doubling down on its image. Urban VIII's family crest even appeared on Bernini's works, blending piety with personal branding, a Renaissance influencer. Centuries before Instagram, the Cadaver Synod, with its corpse-popping theatrics, was mostly a whispered embarrassment now, tucked away beneath the layers of marble and gold. But you can't help but imagine the Vatican servants discreetly avoiding the topic, like that one weird uncle no one talks about. The papacy also starts expanding its influence beyond Europe. Missionaries spread Christianity across the Americas, Asia, and Africa, often accompanied by the flag and sword of European powers. The church's spiritual empire mirrors its territorial one. Formosus's odd fate, in contrast, remains a localized legend, an eccentric footnote in Rome's sprawling history. Yet his story underscores the tension between spiritual authority and earthly politics that persists through every papal reign. As you sink deeper into your pillow, the distant toll of church bells drifts through your mind, mingling with memories of robed figures, solemn processions, and restless bones. You're nearing the late afternoon of papal history now, where shadow and light play intricate games across marble halls and whispered prayers. The night moves onward, and your mind drifts like a candle flame in a gentle breeze, flickering between moments of clarity and dream. The story carries you into a time when the papacy faces its next big challenge, modernity itself. By the 18th century, Europe is buzzing with new ideas. The Enlightenment, reason, science, and skepticism become the new gospel for many. The church, sitting atop centuries of tradition, looks increasingly out of place in this bright new world. Here's your historical fact. In 1769, Pope Clement XIV officially suppresses the Jesuit order, a powerful religious group known for education and missionary work under pressure from European monarchs who see them as a threat. This is a huge deal because the Jesuits have been the church's intellectual elite. Now the quirky tidbit: the Jesuits had a reputation for being both incredibly clever and a bit sneaky. Rumors swirled that they brewed a secret weapon called the Jesuit potion, a mysterious concoction said to grant persuasive power. Obviously, historians dismiss this as colorful gossip, but it's fun to imagine. Historians still argue whether Clement XIV's decision was a pragmatic political move to save the papacy or a betrayal of the church's own missionaries and scholars. Either way, it marks a moment when the church is forced to navigate the tricky waters of power politics like never before. Meanwhile, the story of Formosus, remember him, gets caught in an odd twist of Enlightenment thinking as skepticism toward authority grows. His bizarre trial is seen by some as a symbol of outdated superstition and church excess. At the same time, emerging historians start treating the Cadaver Synod less as a scandal and more as a fascinating case study in the extremes of medieval power struggles. The corpse on trial becomes a metaphor for the past the Enlightenment wants to leave behind. Yet, Rome itself refuses to be left behind quietly. Popes begin to modernize administration and infrastructure. Streetlights flicker on. New roads are built. The Vatican becomes more than a religious center, it's a political entity, trying to survive in a changing world. And speaking of politics, the French Revolution erupts in 1789, sending shockwaves through Europe. The papacy, closely tied to monarchies, finds itself under attack from secular forces. Churches are looted, clergy persecuted, and Rome itself threatened. Formosus's posthumous trial is long gone, but the themes it embodied, power struggles, legitimacy, and the fragility of authority, are suddenly very real again. You're lulled by the quiet tension of this moment, the delicate dance between old faith and new reason, between sacred tradition and human progress. As your thoughts blur, you feel the weight of centuries pressing gently down, a reminder that history is never just stories, but living echoes, shaping every breath you take. The night is quiet now, the gentle hum of your fan the only steady rhythm as you slip further into the story's depths. You're entering a time when the papacy faces unprecedented trials, political, spiritual, and existential. After the French Revolution storm, the 19th century dawns with Europe in turmoil. Monarchies are shaken, republics rise and fall, and nationalism spreads like wildfire. The papacy, still a political power thanks to its control over the papal states, struggles to maintain authority in a world that's rapidly modernizing and secularizing. Your historical fact: in 1870, the Kingdom of Italy completes its unification by capturing Rome, effectively ending the papal temporal rule. This event marks the end of the Papal States and the beginning of what's called the Roman Question, a decades-long standoff over the Pope's status and the city's political future. On to the quirky tidbit: Pope Pius IX, who reigned during this time, became the longest-serving pope in history and famously declared himself a prisoner in the Vatican, refusing to leave after Rome was taken. He even commissioned a statue of himself in chains, a rare papal selfie, if you will. Historians still argue whether Pius IX's stubborn refusal to accept Italy's control was an act of principled resistance or political obstinance that isolated the church. Either way, it highlights the papacy's awkward transition from temporal ruler to spiritual leader. And somewhere beneath this tension lies the echo of Formosus. The absurdity of the Cadaver Synod serves as a grim reminder that papal authority, no matter how divine it claims to be, is always vulnerable to political machinations. During this period, the Vatican begins to redefine its role not as a territorial power, but as a spiritual authority with global influence. Diplomatic relations expand, and the Pope's voice becomes an international one. Meanwhile, new technology like the telegraph and printing press spreads information faster than ever. Rumors and scandals about popes, real or exaggerated, travel beyond Rome's walls. The Church also grapples with modern ideas, challenging its doctrines, sparking internal debates and reforms. Amid these sweeping changes, Formosus' story endures as a curious historical footnote and a cautionary tale. The notion of a pope's corpse dragged into court is so bizarre it refuses to fade away, reminding everyone that the line between sacred and profane can blur spectacularly. As your eyes grow heavy, you imagine the stone corridors of the Vatican, filled with whispered histories, silent witnesses to centuries of power, faith, and human drama. And somewhere in the stillness, the bones of a long-dead pope lie waiting, perhaps hoping no one will bring up the ridiculous trial again. The darkness thickens, but your mind stays gently alert, weaving through the intricate tapestry of papal history. You're now moving into the early 20th century, a time of profound change and challenge for the Catholic Church. The world has modernized at a dizzying pace: industrial revolutions, world wars, and new political ideologies sweep across continents. The papacy, once a territorial sovereign, is now a spiritual giant caught between tradition and the demand for modernization. Here's your historical fact. In 1929, the Lateran Treaty is signed, creating the Vatican City-state, a tiny, independent nation within Rome. This treaty finally resolves the Roman question, giving the Pope full sovereignty over this tiny enclave. The treaty is a diplomatic masterstroke, allowing the Church to maintain its independence and spiritual authority while accepting the political realities of modern Italy. Now, for a quirky detail. Benito Mussolini, the Italian dictator who signed the treaty on behalf of Italy, reportedly joked that the Vatican was the only state he knew that could fit in his office. The Vatican's entire territory is less than half a square kilometer, small enough to lose your keys in. Historians still argue whether the Lateran Treaty was a genuine reconciliation or a pragmatic political move by both sides to maintain stability amid rising tensions in Europe. Meanwhile, the Church faces challenges beyond politics. It wrestles with modernism, a movement within Catholicism seeking to reconcile faith with contemporary science, philosophy, and biblical criticism. The Vatican condemns many modernist ideas, fearing they undermine core doctrines. And then there's the shadow of Formosus, still lurking in the background. His posthumous trial symbolizes, for some scholars, the dangers of intertwining religion and politics too closely, the perils of a spiritual office, dragged into worldly power struggles. As you imagine the Vatican's tiny walls under the Roman sky, the ancient stones whisper of centuries past, of popes crowned and unmade, of rituals that once summoned the dead from their graves. The world outside races on, but inside those walls, time seems to fold back on itself. The echoes of history blending past and present into one continuous breath. Your eyelids flutter, the story weaving a cocoon around you, inviting you to drift further into the folds of memory and myth, of bones and power, and the eternal dance between them. The night deepens further, and your thoughts slow, drawn into the quiet pulse of history's undercurrent. Now you're entering the papacy's mid-20th century era, a time marked by global upheaval and transformation. World War II devastates Europe, and the Vatican, nestled within Rome, finds itself in a delicate position. The Church tries to maintain neutrality, but its role is controversial and complex, balancing moral authority with political survival. Your historical fact: Pope Pius XII, 1939 to 1958, led the Church through the war, controversially criticized for his silence on the Holocaust while quietly aiding some victims. His wartime role remains one of the most debated papal legacies. A quirky tidbit: the Vatican Swiss Guards, those famously colorful, Renaissance-dressed soldiers, actually smuggled people to safety during the war, using their diplomatic status and a flair for the dramatic to protect refugees. Think of it as the world's most stylish underground resistance. Historians still argue whether Pius XII's silence was prudent diplomacy or a moral failure. The debate continues to echo in academic halls and public discourse alike. The Church also prepares for the future. In 1962, Pope John XXIII calls the Second Vatican Council, a major assembly aiming to modernize church practices and doctrine. One significant outcome: the shift from Latin to local languages in the Mass, making worship more accessible to ordinary people. Imagine decades of solemn Latin suddenly replaced by your own language. A radical change for a tradition-bound institution. Formosus' odd story is all but forgotten now in everyday Vatican life. But scholars occasionally revisit the Cadaver Synod as a reminder of the Church's colorful, sometimes macabre history, a cautionary tale about power gone grotesquely awry. Meanwhile, the world outside grows louder, faster, more interconnected. The Church adapts, grappling with new ethical questions, social justice, and its place in a rapidly changing society. You feel the weight of these centuries pressing gently, like soft velvet against your skin. The layers of history folding around you as you drift closer to sleep. The past and present merge, the echoes of popes and synods blending into the gentle night, carrying you forward on a tide of stories and whispers. You're floating through the corridors of the Vatican again, though now the walls are plastered with modern art and fluorescent lights hum, instead of torch flickers. The scent of burning incense has been joined by the faint tang of coffee and printed bulletins. It's the late 20th century, and the papacy is reinventing itself like a tired actor taking on a fresh role, complete with press conferences and jet travel. At the center of this transformation stands Karol Wojtyła, the Polish cardinal elected Pope John Paul II in 1978. Here's your mainstream historical fact. He becomes the first non-Italian pope in 455 years, and then goes on to lead more than 100 international trips, earning the nickname the Pilgrim Pope as he crisscrosses the globe to reach out to millions. His charisma and energy electrify the church and the world alike. And yet, as you drift past gleaming papal limousines and crowded public squares, you glimpse the shadows. The church is still wrestling with the legacies of its past. Formosus' corpse trial now a distant echo. But the deeper fear remains. What if the highest office can be manipulated again? Here's a fringe tidbit. Some conspiracy-minded bloggers later claimed that John Paul II kept a secret, handwritten diary locked away in the Apostolic Palace, filled with confessions of fallen cardinals and classified politics, kind of like Vatican whistleblower porn. There's no proof it ever existed, and historians still argue whether those rumors were simply modern myth-making or a reflection of genuine secrecy within the Vatican walls. Meanwhile, John Paul II's papacy is marked by both sweeping outreach and stark controversies. He plays a crucial role in opposing communism, especially in his native Poland, which helps catalyze the Solidarity movement and contributes to the eventual collapse of the Soviet bloc in 1989. This is no small feat. Here you have a religious leader who becomes a key geopolitical actor on the world stage. Yet beneath the cheering crowds, darker murmurs grow louder. The church faces growing revelations of sexual abuse scandals, and even John Paul II's administration can't hide from the crisis. As you imagine cardinals in velvet cassocks reading exposes in the Vatican library, you sense the institution's fragility. The same mechanisms that once enabled the Cadaver Synod spectacle can now facilitate systematic cover-ups. Historians still argue whether John Paul II did enough to confront these abuses, or whether his emphasis on global unity overshadowed the need for internal reckoning. That debate continues to define how the modern church views accountability, transparency, and moral leadership. Still, you can't deny his impact. He presides over the Jubilee year 2000, marking two millennia of Christianity with massive gatherings in Rome, radio addresses beamed worldwide, and an emotionally charged New Year's Mass. The world watches as he invites the faithful to confess, forgive, and reconcile, a poignant counterpoint to the Church's history of posthumous trials and power plays. As the millennium turns, John Paul II's health begins to decline. Parkinson's disease slows his gait, and you picture him leaning heavily on a white cane, delivering homilies with a voice both frail and defiant. It's a reminder that even the most dynamic leaders are subject to time's relentless march. You glide through scenes of pilgrims kissing the foot of Michelangelo's Pieta, reporters crowding the papal apartments, and candlelit vigils in St. Peter's Square. The church is adapting to talk, show culture, running websites alongside ancient manuscripts, and wrestling with how to honor tradition while speaking to modern hearts. Formosus' story, once an epic of corpse and court, is now referenced in seminaries as a cautionary past, like an old warning posted on a digital bulletin board. Yet in every new crisis, every scandal inquiry, you hear that unspeakable whisper: power can be misused even in God's name. And so you, drifting closer to sleep. Since the Vatican is both fortress and fishbowl, a place where faith, politics, and human frailty collide under chandeliers and giant screens. The night is deep, but dawn approaches, carrying new challenges, new popes, and the persistent ghost of a long-ago trial. You're dozing through your cultural feed when suddenly you stumble on the Cadaver Synod again, this time in pop culture. Coffee in hand, you click on a true crime podcast that drops you into the bizarre 897 trial as if it were the latest serial killer craze. You're hooked because corpse trials make for killer audio, pun intended. The weird thing is, this ancient, moldy story keeps resurfacing. In 1983, the Italian composer Ennio Morricone crafted an avant-garde opera, Formosus Reanimated, dramatizing the corpse's court appearance with ghostly choruses and wailing trombones of mainstream. Fact that proves even boundary-pushing composers can't resist medieval drama. Critics praised its eerie atmosphere but questioned whether it was sacrilegious or simply sensational. Historians still argue whether Morricone's portrayal was historically grounded or a delightfully macabre fantasy. They sniff in journals. Meanwhile, TV writers lurk in dimly lit writers' rooms, whispering what if Game of Thrones had a necro-legal system. One fringe tidbit claims that the popular fantasy series Dead Crown features an episode so reminiscent of the Cadaver Synod that fans joke the writers binge-read 9th century church canons. For gimmicks, you watch the skeletal stand-in being cross-examined by a robe-clad zealot and think, yep, that's medieval Netflix for you. And then there are podcasts. Bone to be Wild dedicates an entire hour to unpacking the logistics. How do you prop a corpse upright without it toppling over mid-testimony? They interview costumers, legal historians, even morticians who suggest the original trial probably smelled worse than your uncle's gem bag. Historians still argue whether these reconstruction theories overstate or understate the logistical nightmare of reanimating a rotted pope. On the page, novelists use Formosus as a metaphor. In the bestseller Trial of the Silent, the protagonist defends a resurrected statesman accused of treason, echoing the real-life corpse synod in every overheard whisper. One quirky detail: the author admits she drove to Rome at midnight hoping to see Formosus, only to find it lost under a fancy marble floor, replaced by a gift shop selling papal bobbleheads. Even comic book artists haven't resisted. In Vatican Noir, a grim detective story, the hero uncovers a secret society worshipping the trial pope as a martyr of ecclesiastical corruption. He quips, "I've seen dead men walk but never stand for interrogation." You laugh, though you'd probably question his lack of safety goggles. Historians still debate why the Cadaver Synod captivates us today. Is it morbid fascination or a deeper fear that those in power can exploit even death itself? Some scholars argue it's a cautionary tale about the extremes of political vengeance. Others see it as an absurd footnote that shouldn't overshadow real theological developments. Either way, you sense a collective thrill whenever someone resurrects Formosus for modern media, as if we can't resist checking under the coffin lid one more time. And so the story circles back into your life over and over through operas, podcasts, novels, and TV, reminding you that certain scandals never sleep. Even centuries later, a rotting pope on trial can still stir our imaginations, spark debates about justice and power, and maybe keep you awake just a bit longer. You're nearly at dawn now, cocooned in the hush before daybreak. Yet the echo of that 897 trial still circles your mind like a raven's caw in an empty courtyard. The Cadaver Synod isn't just a quirky medieval footnote, it's become a haunting reminder that even the most solemn institutions can slip into grotesque theatrics. You feel its chill in every modern headline about political vendettas, every judicial overreach, and every time the powerful remind us that they're only human. Consider this mainstream historical fact. By the 19th century, scholars like Gregorius were already drawing parallels between the Cadaver Synod and modern show trials, arguing that spectacle courts are less about justice and more about power projection. Such comparisons underscore how a dead pope's humiliation still resonates as a symbol of tyranny dressed up in legality. Historians still argue whether these analogies are fair, or whether they overstate the medieval trial's influence on later legal abuses, but the image endures. You can almost smell the damp catacombs when you think of it, the half-rotten incense, the mildew cur eeping across stone altars, the iron tang of blood on judicial robes. And then there's that fringe tale. In the 1970s, a West German filmmaker shot a surreal short film reenacting the Cadaver Synod, using stop-motion puppets made from old ecclesiastical vestments. Critics called it both sacrilegious and hypnotic, and it toured underground art houses for years. It's a testament to how artists keep reaching back into that moment, dragging its shadows forward. The Cadaver Synod also haunts you through language. We talk about trial by ordeal, show trials, even kangaroo courts. These phrases owe part of their vividness to the idea that justice can be mocked by turning the defendant into a symbol, sometimes a macabre one. You sense it whenever a journalist writes about a political corpse or an exhumed controversy. The metaphor wouldn't land so hard if we hadn't witnessed its medieval prototype. And here's the scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether the Cadaver Synod was a unique aberration and unrepeatable horror, or the logical endpoint of treating law as a weapon. Some assert it was a tragic outlier, driven by personal vendettas and regional power plays. Others maintain it revealed a deeper rot in the concept of posthumous rights and canonical legitimacy. Did the medieval church cross a line only once? Or did that line always lurk beneath every decree and excommunication? Feel the weight of that question settle in your chest, like a stone pressed down by unseen hands. You imagine modern leaders wobbling under similar scrutiny. How many reputations have been exhumed, metaphorically, to face trials long after the facts have faded? How many digital skeletons lurk in our pasts, ready to be unearthed for political performance? Still, the Cadaver Synod continues to inspire reflection, caution, even a kind of morbid comfort. Because if a pope could be judged by his corpse, then maybe no one is beyond accountability. Maybe history's darkest spectacle also offers a weird kind of hope, that the dead hold power over the living, insisting on a reckoning that transcends time. You curl deeper under the covers, the window pane chilled with pre-dawn dew, and feel the story wrap around you like a memory you can't shake. The tomb of Formosus might lie beneath marble, but his trial remains etched in our collective imagination, an unsettling chapter that reminds us just how far institutions can stray when vengeance takes the reins. And now, as light seeps in, you carry that uneasy hush with you, a whisper that power unchecked can resurrect horrors, and that even the most sacred authority must fear the verdict of history. You're almost dawn's light now, drifting on the final currents of this to our voyage through centuries of papal triumphs and travesties. The story you followed spanning exile, corpse trials, crusades, schisms, and modern reinventions comes full circle here. At the edge of history and memory, you've seen popes live and die, be deposed or exalted, and even stand on trial after death. And finally, it's time to lay Pope Formosus to rest in your mind. At least stay and reflect on how a single corpse still haunts the halls of power. Picture the Vatican today. Crowds gather under Bernini's fountains, selfie sticks aim at gleaming domes, and Swiss guards mill about, less likely to smuggle fugitives and more likely to politely redirect tourists. Yet beneath the polished granite lies a story older than any marble floor, the tale of Formosus, whose bones once crossed into the realm of theater and became a symbol too strange to ignore. Historians still argue whether Formosus' posthumous trial was an incredible one-off event born of personal vendettas or a symptom of a deeper, more systemic power play in 9th century Rome. Some scholars see it as the logical conclusion of using ecclesiastical law as a weapon. Others insist it was a grotesque aberration, an alien moment in an otherwise sober institution. Either way, this bizarre spectacle continues to captivate because it forces us to confront human ambitions, limits, and what happens when those limits are ignored. One mainstream fact: in 1966, the Vatican officially nullified all decrees related to the Cadaver Synod, restoring Formosus' legacy within the Church's archives and erasing his condemnation from canon law. This act of rehabilitation wasn't fanfare or parade, it was a quiet, bureaucratic gesture acknowledging that burying injustice, even centuries old, must sometimes be more than figurative. Yet one fringe tidbit suggests that in the Vatican's secret archives, a dusty manuscript still bears the original minutes of the synod, ink smeared by moisture and time, with a marginal doodle of a skeleton bowing in flogged ropes. Scholars whisper about its existence, but no one outside a handful of archivists has laid eyes on it in generations. If true, it's a haunting echo. The trial lives on in the Church's hidden heart, even as official records claim oblivion. Through every twist, popes bribing for their thrones, emperors groveling in snow, crusaders waving blessed banners, reformers nailing theses, Formosus' trial remained the ultimate reminder that spiritual authority, like any power, can be misused when vengeance overtakes mercy. His story became a cautionary ghost, perching on every new misstep and demanding that the living remember the cost of spectacle and the dangers of posthumous justice. Today, you walk away from the saga carrying its echoes. You might see a headline about a modern show trial or a political vendetta revived decades later, and feel a chill, as if that medieval specter has whispered in your ear. You might glimpse the terms exhumed, controversy, or skeletons in the closet, and recall how literal they once were in Rome's stone halls. And you might, in your quiet moments, consider how institutions, religious or otherwise, must guard against turning justice into theater. Formosus' final fate is posthumous rehabilitation. His bones reinterred in St. Peter's under a simple tomb serves as both resolution and reminder. The Church chose to forgive its dead, to restore his honor, and to acknowledge that some acts are too grotesque to leave unaddressed. Yet even in forgiveness, the memory persists, a warning carved in stone and ink. A story that flows through time like the Tiber itself. As you hover on the threshold between wakefulness and sleep, sense how stories shape our understanding of power, legacy, and justice. Pope Formosus may lie in eternal rest beneath marble, but his tale resonates, still urging us to weigh mercy against vengeance, to question authority, and to remember that sometimes the greatest trial is the one we carry within our own hearts. Let your breathing slow now. Each inhale soft and even like a gentle prayer. Picture a vast chapel, its candles flickering in an almost breathless hush, as centuries of echoes settle into silence. The story of Formosus' life of exile, return, coronation, death, and posthumous trial now fades into stillness, leaving behind only the faintest glow of memory. Rest assured that the choices of popes and princes, the clang of gavels on empty pulpits, and the drama of a corpse on trial will not echo into your dreams as shrill alarms, but as a quiet reminder that all things pass. Empires crumble, reputations shift like desert sands, and even the mightiest offices must yield to time's gentle inevitability. Imagine laying down your own burdens at the foot of an old altar, trusting that mercy endures beyond the harshest sentences. Feel the weight of history lift, replaced by soft candlelight dancing across worn stone. The past can be both teacher and comforter, its lessons whispered not to frighten, but to guide you toward compassion and understanding. So, sink deeper into your pillow, let the world's clamors drift beyond your window, and hold this calm in your chest. The trial of a dead pope may seem bizarre, but it stands as testament to humanity's capacity for both cruelty and forgiveness. May the paradox become your lullaby. Sleep comes on the wings of acceptance. Good night, and may your dreams be gentler than these corridors of power and infinitely more restful.